The smell of warm, sugary churros filled the air as cars rushed past the busy intersection. Among the honking horns and the impatient drivers, a small figure stood by the curb, clutching a tray of freshly made churros. Her name was Isabella, a 12-year-old girl with kind brown eyes and a heart far too big for her age. Every day, just before the sun rose, she would wake up, help her grandmother prepare the dough, and then head to the traffic light where she sold churros to passing motorists. She didn't do it for herself. She did it for her father. Her father, Miguel, had once been a strong man, always working tirelessly to provide for their little family. But life had other plans. A severe illness left him bedridden, too weak to work, too weak to even stand for long periods. Hospital bills stacked up like mountains, and medicine was expensive. Isabella knew that if she didn't step up, no one else would. So, while other kids her age were at school, playing in the park, or watching cartoons, she was here, on the street, doing everything she could to keep her father alive. Most days were the same. Some drivers were kind, rolling down their windows to buy a churro or two, sometimes even giving her a little extra money without taking the food. Others ignored her completely, staring straight ahead as if she didn't exist. Then, there were the ones who looked at her with pity, as if she were nothing more than a sad story. They would forget the moment the light turned green, but Isabella didn't let it bother her. She had a mission, and she was determined to succeed. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and orange, Isabella stood at her usual spot, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. She called out in her sweet, hopeful voice, "Fresh churros, hot and crispy. Help my father get better." Some drivers smiled at her. Some waved her away. But then, something happened that changed everything. A sleek black car rolled up to the front of the line. The tinted window slowly lowered, revealing a well-dressed man in his late 30s. His suit was expensive. His watch gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, studied Isabella for a moment. He didn't immediately speak, which made her nervous. Was he about to scold her for being on the street? Was he just another person who would pity her and drive away? But then, he smiled, a small knowing smile. "How much for the whole tray?" he asked. Isabella's eyes widened. "The whole tray," she repeated, almost in disbelief. She had never sold all her churros in one go before. The man nodded. "Yes. How much?" She quickly calculated the price in her head, her hands trembling slightly. $30, sir." Without hesitation, the man pulled out his wallet, took out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to her. "Keep the change," he said, taking the tray from her hands. Isabella was speechless. $100. That was more than she usually made in a week. Her heart pounded with excitement. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." But before she could say anything more, the man's window rolled up, and the car sped away. Isabella stood there, holding the money tightly in her hands, feeling like she had just stepped into a dream. That night, she ran home with more energy than she had in weeks. She showed the money to her grandmother, who gasped in shock, and together, they planned how to use it. Medicine for her father, a little more food for the week, maybe even saving some for the next hospital visit. It felt like a blessing, a stroke of luck they desperately needed. But luck, as Isabella would soon learn, was a tricky thing, because the next day, the same black car was waiting for her at the intersection. And this time, the man wasn't just there to buy churros. Isabella hesitated as she saw the sleek black car waiting at the traffic light. The same man from the day before sat behind the tinted window, watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Why was he back? Was something wrong with the churros she had sold him? Had she made a mistake with the money? 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind as she clutched her tray, her fingers gripping it tightly. The window rolled down smoothly, and the man's calm, steady voice broke the tension. "Good morning, Isabella," he said, as if he had known her forever. She swallowed hard. "Good morning, sir," she replied cautiously. She didn't remember telling him her name. He smiled, leaning slightly toward the window. "Relax. I asked around. People here know you well." Isabella shifted on her feet. It was true. She had been selling churros at this traffic light for months. Street vendors, shop owners, even some of the regular drivers recognized her. But it still felt strange to hear her name come from someone who had only seen her once. "How's your father?" the man asked. His question caught her off guard. Most people didn't ask. They bought a churro, maybe gave her a sympathetic look, and drove away. But this man seemed interested. "He's okay," she said carefully. "The money you gave me helped a lot. Thank you again, sir." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "I want to help more." Isabella blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Help? More? Yes," he said, glancing at the traffic light before returning his gaze to her. "I need someone like you, smart, hardworking, willing to do whatever it takes for family. I could give you a job. A job." The word hung in the air between them. She already had a job, selling churros to survive. But something about the way he said it felt different. "What kind of job?" she asked hesitantly. He smiled again, but this time there was something else in his expression, a quiet intensity. "Something that pays a lot more than selling churros," he said. "Something that could change your father's life." Isabella's chest tightened. It sounded too good to be true. No one just offered a poor street vendor girl a high-paying job for no reason. There had to be a catch. The traffic light turned green, and the cars behind him started honking impatiently. The man glanced at his watch, then back at her. "Think about it," he said, sliding a small piece of paper onto the curb. "Call me if you're interested." With that, the window rolled up, and the car sped away. Isabella stood frozen for a long moment before finally picking up the paper. A name and a phone number were scrawled across it, in neat, precise handwriting. No business. Name, no explanation, just a number. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their tiny home. Her father coughed weakly from the other room, and her grandmother whispered prayers beside him. The $100 from the day before had helped, but it wouldn't last forever. Medicine, rent, food. It was never enough. Her fingers tightened around the piece of paper. What if this was her chance? What if this was the answer to everything? The next morning, she borrowed her grandmother's old cell phone and dialed the number. A deep voice answered immediately. "Isabella, I was hoping you'd call." She swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" There was a pause, and then the man chuckled softly. "Meet me," he said. "We'll talk in person." Her stomach twisted. She knew this was risky. She knew she should say no, but the sound of her father's weak breathing filled her mind. And before she could stop herself, she whispered, "Okay." The man gave her an address, not far from where she sold her churros, but in a part of town she had never dared to walk alone. It was an old building, the kind where the windows were covered with thick curtains, and the doors had too many locks. When she arrived, he was already waiting. "Come inside," he said, motioning her in. Isabella hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to run back to the busy streets where she belonged. But then she thought of her father. She thought of the hospital bills, and she stepped inside. The air inside was heavy, and the room was dimly lit. A small desk sat The corner, stacks of papers neatly organized on top. The man leaned against it, watching her carefully. "I help people," he said finally. "People like you, who need money, who have no other options. But it's not easy. It requires trust. And once you start, there's no turning back." She clenched her fists. "What do you need me to do?" He studied her, then slowly slid a small package across the desk. "Take this to a woman at the next intersection," he said. "She'll be waiting near the fruit stand. She'll give you something in return. Bring it back to me." Isabella's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a job. This was something else, something dangerous. Her breath caught in her throat. She could walk away right now. Pretend this never happened. Go back to selling churros and hoping for another miracle. Or she could take the package and change everything. Her hands trembled as she reached forward, and then she made her choice. Isabella's fingers hovered over the small package. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She knew this wasn't normal, that this wasn't just any delivery, but the thought of her father, lying weak in their small home, gasping for breath, made the choice for her. She picked up the package. It was lighter than she expected, wrapped tightly in brown paper. The man watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said. "Now don't open it. Just take it to the woman at the fruit stand. She'll be waiting." Isabella nodded, gripping the package tightly. She turned and left, her mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. The streets felt different now, less familiar, as if the world had shifted slightly. The usual sounds of traffic and street vendors calling out their prices seemed distant, drowned out by the weight of what she was carrying. As she neared the fruit stand, she spotted the woman almost immediately. She was older, maybe in her 50s, wearing a plain green dress with a small basket of oranges beside her. She wasn't buying anything, just standing there, scanning the crowd. Isabella swallowed hard and walked up to her. "This is for you," she said quietly, handing over the package. The woman took it without a word, slipping it into her purse with practiced ease. Then, just as quickly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, pressing it into Isabella's hand. "Go back," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of people. Isabella's fingers tightened around the envelope. She didn't know what was inside, but she had a feeling it wasn't just money. She turned on her heel and hurried back, her legs moving faster than her thoughts. When she reached the old building, the man was waiting by the door, his arms crossed. She handed him the envelope, her hands slightly shaking. He took it, opened it, and nodded approvingly. "You did well," he said. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash. Isabella's eyes widened. There had to be at least $200 there, maybe more than she had ever held in her life. "For your father," the man said, pressing the money into her palm. "If you want to do this again, you know where to find me." Isabella stared at the money. It was enough for medicine, enough for food, maybe even enough to take her father to a better doctor. But she felt something else too, a tightness in her chest, an unease she couldn't shake. That night, she sat beside her father's bed, listening to his shallow breaths. She had the money now, but at what cost? What had she just done? And what would happen if she did it again? She thought about the man's offer, about the weight of that small package in her hands, the fear, the doubt, and she knew, deep down, that this was not the life she wanted. The next morning, she took the money and bought her father's medicine. But when she returned to the intersection, she wasn't carrying a package. She was carrying her tray of churros. The black car returned that afternoon. The window rolled down, and the man looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Changed your mind?" he asked. Isabella met his gaze, standing a little taller. "I just want to sell churros," she said firmly. The man studied her for a moment, then let out a small chuckle. "Suit yourself," he said. The window rolled up and the car drove away. Isabella exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in days. She had been given a choice, and she had made the right one. The road ahead was still hard, still uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And as she called out to passing cars, offering warm, sugary churros, she knew she had chosen the path of honesty, of hope, because no amount of money was worth losing herself.